A racist captain attacked Barack and Michelle Obama on a cruise ship, but what happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching us from. The sun was setting over the bustling harbor as Barack and Michelle Obama stepped out of their black SUV, their luggage carefully arranged by their driver. The scene before them was breathtaking. A gleaming cruise ship, its hull, painted a pristine white, towered above the docks like a floating palace. Rows of shimmering lights ran along its decks, glowing softly against the evening sky. It was a sight designed to inspire awe, promising luxury and serenity for all who boarded. For Barack and Michelle, this was meant to be a long-awaited escape from the unrelenting pressures of public life, a time to unwind, reconnect, and enjoy a peaceful journey across the turquoise waters of the Caribbean. As they approached the embarkation area, they noticed how other guests were warmly greeted by staff in crisp uniforms. Smiles, handshakes, and welcoming words filled the air, creating an atmosphere of festive anticipation. Yet, when their turn came, the energy shifted. The uniformed crew member who took their passports hesitated briefly, her polished smile faltering for the smallest fraction of a second. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Michelle noticed. The young woman's eyes darted to a nearby supervisor, who gave a barely discernible nod before stepping forward himself. "Welcome aboard the Elysium, Mr. and Mrs. Obama," he said, his tone measured, almost mechanical. He extended a hand, but his grip lacked warmth, and his gaze flicked away too quickly, as if avoiding prolonged eye contact. "Thank you," Barack replied, his voice calm, though a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. The supervisor gestured to another crew member, who appeared slightly hesitant as she reached for their luggage. Nearby, other passengers were being ushered aboard with lively conversation and enthusiastic attention. A sense of unease began to settle over Michelle. She glanced at Barack, who gave her a reassuring smile, as if to say, "Let's not make assumptions just yet." Once aboard, they were struck by the ship's grandeur. The Elysium was nothing short of spectacular. A floating city with gilded staircases, sparkling chandeliers, and sprawling decks that offered panoramic views of the sea. Michelle had to admit the ambiance was stunning. For a moment, she allowed herself to relax, letting the excitement of the journey replace the faint discomfort she had felt at the dock. Their check-in at the reception desk, however, reignited her unease. The receptionist, a young man with perfectly styled hair and a stiffly polite demeanor, took an uncomfortably long time verifying their reservation. He seemed distracted, glancing frequently at his computer screen and then to a colleague, who whispered something inaudible before quickly walking away. "I'm sorry for the delay," the receptionist finally said, handing over their key cards with an apologetic smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It seems there was a mix-up with the room assignments. You've been placed in one of our premium suites, but it doesn't have the ocean view you originally requested. We'll do our best to rectify this as soon as possible." Michelle's brow furrowed. "Our booking was for an ocean view suite. Are you saying it's unavailable?" The receptionist nodded, his demeanor remaining polite but detached. "Unfortunately, yes. But we assure you, the suite you've been assigned is of the highest quality." Barack placed a calming hand on Michelle's arm before she could press further. "Thank you," he said, his tone measured. "We appreciate your help." As they were escorted to their suite, the unease only deepened. Other guests they passed in the hallways greeted them with a mix of curiosity and reserved politeness, their eyes lingering just a moment too long. When they reached their room, the promised premium suite was tastefully decorated, but noticeably less opulent than the ocean view accommodations they had seen in the promotional materials. The view through the window revealed not the endless expanse of the sea, but a modest deck area partially obscured by lifeboats. "Well," Michelle said, sinking onto the edge of the bed and attempting a smile, "this isn't exactly what I had in mind for luxury." Barack chuckled softly, sitting beside her. "Let's not jump to conclusions. It's just the first day. We'll sort it out tomorrow." Still, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The subtle cues, the hesitant smiles, the whispered conversations, the prolonged check-in, painted a picture that she couldn't ignore. Later that evening, they ventured out to explore the ship. The main dining hall was a magnificent space with vaulted ceilings and a grand piano providing soft background music. They were directed to a table near the back, far from the panoramic windows where other guests dined with a view of the sea. Their waiter, a young man with a strained smile, took their orders quickly and disappeared without offering any of the warmth or small talk they observed at other tables. Michelle noticed how efficiently the staff catered to the needs of the other diners, refilling glasses, delivering meals promptly, and engaging in friendly conversation. At their table, however, service was slow and perfunctory. When their meals finally arrived, the presentation was impeccable, but the delay was noticeable. Barack remained composed throughout the evening, offering gentle reassurances whenever Michelle voiced her observations. "Let's see how tomorrow goes," he said. "It might just be a coincidence." But Michelle wasn't so sure. As they returned to their suite, the corridors were quieter, and the vibrant energy of the ship felt distant. She lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's events in her mind. The feeling that they were being treated differently was no longer a vague suspicion. It was becoming an undeniable reality. The first day on the Elysium had ended, but Michelle knew that the journey ahead would not be the carefree escape they had envisioned. The following morning dawned bright and warm, with sunlight streaming through the suite's modest window. Michelle woke first, her sleep restless and her thoughts unsettled by the events of the previous day. She glanced at Barack, still sleeping peacefully, and sighed quietly. She wanted to believe his optimism, to think that the oddities they'd experienced were just coincidence or poor management. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was off. By the time they made their way to the breakfast deck, the ship was alive with activity. Guests mingled near the buffet, the clinking of glasses and silverware blending with the low hum of conversation. The deck overlooked the ocean, a dazzling expanse of the turquoise stretching to the horizon. It should have been a relaxing start to the day, but Michelle noticed the same patterns of behavior that had unsettled her the night before. As they approached the buffet, a server intercepted them. His smile was polite, but it felt forced, his body language stiff. "Good morning," he said, gesturing toward the nearest table. "I'll bring your coffee shortly." They took their seats, and Michelle's eyes swept the room. Nearby tables were filled with other guests, many of whom were being personally attended to by staff who seemed genuinely warm and welcoming. Yet, here they were, seated at the far edge of the deck, their table partially obscured by a large planter. Minutes ticked by without any sign of the promised coffee. Michelle tapped her fingers on the table, her patience wearing thin. "I'll get it myself," she said, rising from her chair. Barack reached out to stop her. "Let's give it a little more time. Maybe they're just busy." Michelle gave him a skeptical look but sat back down. Moments later, their coffee arrived, along with plates of food that looked hastily prepared. Barack thanked the server, But Michelle couldn't help but notice the man avoided making eye contact as he hurried away. The morning didn't improve. A planned visit to the ship's spa turned into another exercise in frustration. Despite having booked treatments in advance, they were told their reservations couldn't be found. Michelle's irritation boiled over when she overheard the receptionist whispering to a colleague, her voice low but her tone unmistakably dismissive. Maybe they got confused with the booking process, the woman said, glancing in their direction. Barack stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. There seems to be some sort of misunderstanding. We have confirmation emails for these appointments. The receptionist looked flustered, her cheeks reddening. I'm terribly sorry, sir. Let me check again. It took another 20 minutes, but their appointments were eventually reinstated. Still, the interaction left Michelle with a bitter taste in her mouth. As they sat in the relaxation lounge waiting for their treatments, she leaned toward Barack. You can't tell me this is all just bad luck, she said quietly. They're going out of their way to make us feel unwelcome. Barack met her gaze, his expression thoughtful. I'm starting to see it too, he admitted. But let's keep our composure. If we react too strongly, we'll give them exactly what they want. That evening, the tension reached a boiling point during dinner. The dining hall was abuzz with laughter and conversation as the other guests enjoyed their meals. Yet, at the Obamas' table, service was once again slow and inattentive. Their waiter, a young man with a nervous disposition, fumbled their order and brought the wrong dishes twice. Michelle's frustration peaked when she noticed how warmly he interacted with the table nearby, laughing and joking as he poured wine for an older couple. When he finally returned to their table, she couldn't hold back any longer. Is there a problem? She asked, her voice steady but sharp. The waiter froze, his face flushing. No, ma'am, he stammered. I'm very sorry for the delays. Michelle leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. It doesn't seem like you're sorry. It seems like you don't want to serve us. Barack placed a hand on her arm, a silent plea for restraint. The waiter mumbled another apology before retreating to the kitchen. Michelle watched him go, her chest tight with anger. Across the room, the dining hall's grand doors opened and Captain Andrian entered. His uniform was impeccable, his posture commanding as he surveyed the room. Guests greeted him warmly, some even rising from their tables to shake his hand. When he reached the Obamas' table, however, his demeanor shifted. Mr. and Mrs. Obama, he said, his voice smooth but devoid of warmth. I trust you're enjoying your evening. Michelle met his gaze, unflinching. We're trying to. The captain's lips curved into a thin smile. If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to let my staff know. Before Michelle could respond, he turned and strode away, leaving behind a sense of icy dismissal. Barack sighed, rubbing his temples. This is deliberate, Michelle said, her voice low but firm. They're making it clear we don't belong here. I know, Barack replied, but we have to handle this carefully. The evening ended on an even more sour note when Michelle overheard a conversation between two staff members near the dining hall's exit. Their voices were hushed, but their words were unmistakable. They're so entitled, one of them said. Just because they used to be important doesn't mean they are now. Michelle felt her stomach twist. She glanced at Barack, who was already walking toward the elevator. She caught up with him, her mind racing. Back in their suite, the tension between them was palpable. Michelle paced the room, her frustration spilling over. We can't keep letting them treat us like this, she said. We need to say something to someone who'll actually listen. Barack sat on the edge of the bed, his expression thoughtful. "Andrian isn't just the captain," he said. "He's the authority on this ship. If we escalate this, we need to be ready for whatever comes next." Michelle stopped pacing and looked at him. "You think he's behind all of this?" "I don't know," Barack admitted, "but I think it's time we start paying closer attention." The night was restless for both of them, their minds preoccupied with what the next day might bring. The veneer of luxury on the Elysium was cracking, revealing something far more insidious beneath the surface. The next morning dawned with an uneasy stillness that matched the tension simmering beneath the surface of the ship. Michelle awoke to the sound of soft waves lapping against the hull, but the soothing rhythm did little to calm the storm building inside her. She turned to Barack, who was already seated by the small writing desk, flipping through his phone with a furrowed brow. "Anything new?" she asked, her voice still heavy with sleep. Barack glanced up and gave her a small, tight smile. "Nothing promising, just emails and a few updates on the markets, but I keep thinking about last night." Michelle nodded. The memory of their strained dinner lingered, as did the captain's sharp-edged politeness that felt more like veiled disdain. It wasn't just the service, the delays, or the whispers anymore. It was the pattern. The deliberate exclusion, the humiliating oversights, and the simmering hostility that seemed to radiate from certain corners of the crew. "Today," Michelle said firmly, "we stop giving them the benefit of the doubt." Barack leaned back in his chair and studied her. "I'm with you, but we have to be smart. If we push too hard, we'll look like we're overreacting, and that's exactly what they want." Michelle's lips pressed into a thin line. She understood his point, but the thought of simply enduring more of the same treatment was unbearable. "Let's watch," she said. "Pay attention to every detail, every interaction. If they think we're not noticing, they're wrong." After breakfast, another slow, uncomfortable affair marked by late service and lukewarm coffee. They decided to spend the morning exploring the ship. It was an attempt to salvage some enjoyment from their vacation, but as they wandered through the elegant hallways and sunlit decks, Michelle's sense of alienation only deepened. Near the main pool, they stopped to admire the view. Sparkling blue water stretched endlessly, reflecting the clear sky above. The deck was bustling with guests lounging under umbrellas, sipping cocktails and chatting easily with the staff. Yet as Michelle scanned the area, she couldn't ignore how the atmosphere seemed to shift when they entered. A group of women at a nearby table glanced their way, their laughter fading into murmurs. One of them, an older woman in oversized sunglasses, tilted her head and whispered something to her companion, who looked directly at Michelle before quickly looking away. Michelle's shoulders tensed. "Did you see that?" Barack didn't need to ask what she meant. He'd seen it too. "Let it go," he said quietly, "for now." But letting go wasn't easy, not when the patterns kept repeating. The incident at the pool was followed by a confrontation at the spa, where their reserved chairs were mysteriously reassigned to another couple. When Michelle pointed out the mistake, the attendant barely concealed her irritation as she directed them to less desirable seats near the entrance. By lunchtime, Michelle's patience was wearing dangerously thin. They decided to dine at one of the smaller restaurants on the upper deck, hoping for a quieter experience. Instead, they were met with more of the same: long waits, incorrect orders, and strained smiles from staff who seemed eager to move on to other tables. It was during this meal that Michelle finally broke. The waiter, clearly flustered, placed Barack's plate on the table with a sharp clatter, spilling sauce onto the linen tablecloth. He mumbled an apology, but the tone was flat, devoid of sincerity. Michelle set down her fork and leveled her gaze at him. "Is there a problem?" The waiter froze. "No, ma'am," he said quickly. "Because it certainly feels like there's a problem," Michelle continued, her voice steady but unmistakably firm. "This isn't the first time we've been treated like we're an inconvenience, and I'm tired of pretending it's all in my head." Barack reached across the table and placed a calming hand over hers. "Let's take a breath," he said softly. But Michelle wasn't done. She looked back at the waiter. "I want to speak with your manager." The waiter hesitated, then quickly retreated toward the kitchen. Minutes later, Captain Andrian appeared. His posture was as stiff as his perfectly pressed uniform, and the practiced smile on his face didn't quite mask the glint of irritation in his eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Obama," he said smoothly, "I understand there's been a concern about your dining experience." Michelle stood, her shoulders squared. "It's not just about dinner, Captain. It's about the way we've been treated since we boarded this ship. And I think you know exactly what I'm talking about." The captain's smile barely wavered, but there was a flicker of something darker beneath it. "I'm sorry if you feel that way, Mrs. Obama. But I can assure you, my staff is trained to provide the highest level of service to all our guests." "All your guests?" Michelle asked pointedly. Andrian's gaze hardened. "All of them." The tension between them was almost palpable. Barack rose from his seat, stepping closer to Michelle. "We'd appreciate it if you could make sure your staff understands that," he said, his tone calm but carrying unmistakable weight. The captain nodded curtly. "Of course." But as he turned to leave, Michelle caught the briefest flicker of contempt in his expression. It sent a chill down her spine. Later that evening, unable to shake the unease, Michelle took a solitary walk along one of the quieter decks. She needed time to think, to clear her head. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, its surface rippling under the fading light. It should have felt freeing, but instead it felt isolating. As she turned a corner, she heard voices, low, hushed, and unmistakably tense. She froze, pressing herself against the wall. "We need to handle this before it gets out of hand," a man's voice said. She recognized it immediately. Captain Andrian. "They're already making too much noise," another voice replied. "Then we make sure they can't anymore," the captain said. Michelle's breath caught in her throat. She waited until the voices faded before retreating quickly back to their suite, her heart pounding. Barack was sitting by the window when she burst in. "What happened?" She told him everything. Barack's expression darkened. "We need to be careful," he said, "but we also need to be ready." They spent the rest of the night quietly packing their things, unsure of what the next day would bring, but certain that whatever it was, it wouldn't be good. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Michelle stirred awake. She sat up slowly, her mind still clouded by the events of the previous day. The tension from overhearing Captain Andrian's conversation lingered like a bitter aftertaste. She turned to see Barack already dressed, his face set in an expression she knew well, calm but intensely focused. "They're up to something," she said quietly, breaking the morning silence. Barack nodded, his eyes fixed out the small window overlooking the deck. "I don't like it either. We need to be prepared for whatever comes next." Michelle swung her legs out of bed and stood. She felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her shoulders. "I just keep thinking, what if we don't get the chance to stop this before it gets worse?" Barack crossed the room and placed his hands gently on her arms. "We will," he said firmly, "but we need to stay calm." Before Michelle could respond, a loud knock echoed through the room. She tensed as Barack opened the door to find two uniformed security officers standing stiffly in the hallway. "Mr. and Mrs. Obama," one of them said. "Captain Andrian requests your presence on the main deck immediately." Michelle's heart sank. She exchanged a quick glance with Barack before straightening her shoulders. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady despite the unease twisting in her gut. The officers escorted them through the ship, their presence drawing curious stares from the few early risers milling about the decks. The main deck, usually bustling with activity, felt eerily empty. At the far end, Captain Andrian stood waiting, his hands clasped behind his back. His expression was unreadable, but the faintest trace of a smirk tugged at the corners of his lips. "Good morning," he said as they approached. Michelle didn't bother returning the greeting. "What's this about?" Andrian's smile widened slightly. "I'm afraid there's been an issue with your conduct on board." Barack's eyes narrowed. "Our conduct?" The captain nodded. "We've received multiple complaints from both staff and passengers regarding your behavior. Disruptive, argumentative, creating a hostile atmosphere. This is not acceptable aboard my ship." Michelle's mouth dropped open. "Hostile atmosphere?" she repeated. "You mean standing up for ourselves after being treated like second-class citizens?" Andrian's expression hardened. "I'm not here to debate this, Mrs. Obama. I've made my decision." Barack stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You're making a mistake, Captain. We haven't done anything wrong, and you know it." The captain's eyes flickered with something sharp, triumph perhaps, and Michelle felt a chill run down her spine. "I disagree," Andrian said, "and since I am the authority on this vessel, my judgment stands." Michelle clenched her fists. "You can't just kick us off this ship." "Oh, but I can," the captain said, his tone dangerously smooth. "For the safety and comfort of my passengers, I have every right to remove disruptive individuals from my ship." Before Michelle could respond, several more uniformed officers appeared behind the captain. Their presence was clearly meant to intimidate, and it worked. "You're serious," Barack said. "As serious as maritime law allows," Andrian replied. And just like that, it was decided. No negotiation, no appeal. The walk to the lifeboat was the longest of Michelle's life. Guests peered out from balconies and windows, some whispering, others openly gawking. Michelle held her head high, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. But inside, she burned with fury and humiliation. When they reached the edge of the deck, they were met by a small motorized lifeboat bobbing in the waves below. Supplies, water, a few protein bars, and a first aid kit were already stashed inside. "This is inhumane," Michelle said, her voice sharp. "You're leaving us out here like castaways." Captain Andrian stepped closer, lowering his voice so only they could hear. "Consider this a lesson in humility," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Some places simply aren't meant for people like you." Michelle's breath caught in her throat. She opened her mouth to respond, but Barack gently squeezed her arm, signaling her to hold back. "We'll make it," he said quietly, helping her climb down into the boat. The last thing Michelle saw before the lifeboat pulled away was the captain's smirk as he turned his back on them. The first few hours at sea were a blur. Michelle sat hunched in the cramped space, staring at the endless horizon. The heat was oppressive, and the gentle rocking of the boat quickly became nauseating. Barack busied himself checking the supplies and testing the small radio included in the emergency kit. "Signal's weak," he muttered, turning the dial, "but I might be able to boost it." Michelle forced herself to focus. Andrian can't get away with this, she said, her voice raw. This isn't just negligence. It's calculated. It's personal. Barack nodded. We'll make sure he doesn't. Hours stretched into evening, and the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the sky in shades of orange and purple. Michelle took turns scanning the horizon with a small pair of binoculars, hoping for any sign of land or passing ships. Just as despair began to creep in, she spotted something in the distance, a faint outline against the fading light. Barack, she said urgently, pointing. He looked through the binoculars and exhaled sharply. An island. By the time they reached the shore, darkness had fallen. The boat scraped against the sand, and Barack jumped out first, helping Michelle onto solid ground. They were exhausted, but relief washed over them. As they secured the boat and set up a makeshift camp, Michelle's thoughts turned back to Andrian. His smugness, his thinly veiled racism, it fueled her resolve. We need to find a way to expose him, she said. Barack's expression hardened. We will. But as the night closed in, they both knew their fight was only just beginning. The night passed in uneasy silence. The distant roar of waves crashing against the shore echoed through the darkness as Michelle sat by the small campfire, its flickering light dancing across her face. Barack slept lightly beside her, his arm draped protectively over their meager supplies. Despite the exhaustion that weighed heavily on her body, Michelle's mind refused to rest. Images of Captain Andrian's smirking face and the humiliating exile replayed in her thoughts, each memory igniting a fresh wave of anger. The island was remote, a sliver of sand and jungle surrounded by endless water. It was beautiful in its own wild way, but to Michelle it felt like a prison. She stood and began pacing near the shoreline, her footsteps leaving faint imprints in the damp sand. The stars above sparkled like scattered diamonds, but their beauty did little to calm her storming mind. Barack stirred and sat up, his eyes immediately finding her silhouette. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly. She shook her head, crossing her arms against the cool night breeze. "I can't stop thinking about him," she admitted. "And what he's getting away with right now? How many more people like us do you think he's treated this way?" Barack rose and joined her, slipping his arm around her shoulders. "We're not done yet," he said, his voice steady. "We're going to make sure the world knows exactly what happened." They spent the early hours of the morning combing through their supplies, planning their next steps. The emergency kit had included a small waterproof notebook and pen, tools that Michelle immediately began using to document everything they had experienced, from the first uncomfortable glances to the captain's final words before leaving them adrift. "We need evidence," Barack said as he inspected the radio again. "If we can prove what Andrian's been doing, we'll have a chance to expose him." Michelle nodded. "And we need to survive long enough to do it." The day unfolded in a blur of activity. Barack scouted the edges of the island, searching for anything useful, while Michelle tended to the fire and rationed their food and water. It wasn't long before Barack returned with a discovery that shifted their focus entirely. Nestled within the jungle, partially buried beneath layers of foliage, was a rusted metal container. The faded logo on its side suggested it had once belonged to the cruise company that owned the Elysium. Inside, they found stacks of crates filled with bottled water, canned goods, and, most curiously, sealed envelopes and ledgers. Michelle's pulse quickened as she flipped through the documents. "These are manifests," she said, her eyes scanning the pages. "Records of cargo, shipments they never declared." Barack leaned over her shoulder, studying the papers. "Smuggling?" "Looks like it," Michelle replied, pulling out a ledger filled with coded entries. "And judging by how well hidden this is, I'd bet Andrian's involved." The discovery reignited their determination. Over the next several hours, they sifted through the crates, documenting everything they found. Michelle photographed the ledgers and cargo labels using the small waterproof camera included in their kit, preserving the evidence. By evening, they had pieced together a damning narrative, one that tied Captain Andrian and the cruise line to illegal trafficking operations. "This is bigger than we thought," Barack said, setting down the camera. "It's not just racism. It's corruption, exploitation. And now we have proof," Michelle said, her voice trembling with adrenaline. But gathering evidence was only the first step. Getting it out to the world was another challenge entirely. The radio crackled faintly as Barack adjusted the dial, searching for any signal. Hours passed, but finally, a faint voice broke through the static. "This is Coastal Patrol, Channel 16. Identify yourself." Relief flooded Michelle's chest. She reached for the radio, but Barack stopped her. "Not yet," he said. She frowned. "What do you mean?" "We can't just call for help and leave it at that," Barack said. "If Andrian intercepts the signal, he'll bury this before it ever gets out. We need to be smart." Michelle hesitated but nodded. "So, what do we do?" "We send the evidence first." Using the emergency beacon's GPS function, Barack transmitted their coordinates along with the photographs of the documents, encrypting the signal before broadcasting it on multiple frequencies. It was a gamble, but it was the only way to ensure the evidence reached someone before Andrian could cover his tracks. Hours later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the radio crackled again. "Mr. and Mrs. Obama, this is Coastal Patrol. We've received your transmission. Hold your position. Help is on the way." Relief washed over Michelle, but it was short-lived. "Barack," she said, her voice low, "what if they get here and Andrian finds out before they can help us?" Barack's eyes darkened. "Then we make sure we're ready." As night fell, Michelle and Barack stayed vigilant, taking turns keeping watch. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows across the sand. It felt like a fragile barrier against the vast darkness pressing in from the jungle and sea. The first sign of danger came just before dawn. A faint hum vibrated through the air, the unmistakable sound of an approaching motor. Michelle shot up, her heart pounding. "They're coming," she whispered. Barack grabbed the emergency flare gun and stepped toward the shoreline. Moments later, the silhouette of a small boat emerged from the darkness. But it wasn't the Coastal Patrol, it was the Elysium's launch boat. And Captain Andrian was standing at the bow. Michelle's breath caught as the captain's voice rang out over the water. "Time's up," he said. What followed was a tense standoff. Andrian demanded they surrender the evidence, insisting that their claims were baseless and would never hold up against his reputation. But Barack refused. "You're finished," he said, raising the flare gun. "The world already knows what you've done." The captain's face twisted in anger, but before he could respond, a new sound filled the air, the distant roar of a helicopter. Michelle's heart leapt as the Coastal Patrol's aircraft appeared over the horizon. The captain's confidence faltered, and he turned back toward his crew. "Get us out of here," he barked, but it was too late. The patrol boat arrived moments later, cutting off the launch's escape. Within minutes, Andrian was surrounded and placed under arrest. As the sun rose, Michelle and Barack finally allowed themselves to breathe. They watched as the authorities secured the scene, loading the evidence and escorting Andrian and his men away in handcuffs. "This isn't over," Michelle said softly, staring at the horizon. "No," Barack agreed, "but it's a start." The sun hung low in the sky as Michelle and Barack Obama sat in the shade of a large palm tree on the island's narrow beach. Though the immediate danger had passed and Captain Andrian was in custody, the weight of the past few days still lingered heavily on their shoulders. The rhythmic crash of the waves against the shore should have been soothing, but Michelle couldn't shake the tension that gripped her. Even now, as rescue crews secured the scene and collected the crates of evidence, she felt uneasy. Barack glanced at her, reading the concern in her eyes. "You're thinking about what happens next," he said quietly. Michelle nodded. "It's not over," she said. "Exposing Andrian and his crimes is just the first step. What about the system that let him operate like this for so long? What about the people who covered for him?" Barack reached for her hand and gave it a reassuring squeeze. "We'll keep pushing," he said. "We've come too far to stop now." The hum of the helicopter that had brought the Coastal Patrol team still echoed in her ears, but Michelle's thoughts kept circling back to the faces of the staff on the Elysium, the fear and helplessness she'd seen in their eyes. People like Lucia, who had risked everything to help them. People who didn't have the same platform or voice that she and Barack did. "They'll need protection," she said suddenly. Barack raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "The staff. People like Lucia. Once this story breaks, there's going to be backlash. The cruise line will throw them under the bus to protect itself." Barack's expression darkened. "You're right." He stood, brushing sand from his pants. "We need to make sure they're not silenced." The ride back to the mainland was tense. Michelle and Barack sat in the back of the patrol boat, their eyes fixed on the horizon as the island faded into the distance. Lucia sat across from them, clutching her small bag and glancing nervously at the officers. "Are you sure this is safe?" she asked quietly. Michelle leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "You're not alone in this, Lucia. We'll make sure you're protected." Lucia's eyes welled with tears. "I never thought anyone would believe me," she said. Barack nodded. "They will now, and not just believe you, they'll listen." When they arrived at the port, reporters were already waiting. News of the rescue had leaked, and camera flashes lit up the dock as Michelle and Barack stepped off the boat. Questions flew at them from all directions, but Barack held up a hand, signaling for calm. "We'll make a statement soon," he said firmly, "but right now, we need to make sure the people who helped us are safe." Lucia kept her head down as they moved through the crowd, but Michelle stayed close, shielding her from the chaos. The days that followed were a blur of press conferences, interviews, and meetings. The evidence they had uncovered, both the documents from the crates and the video recordings Barack had taken, painted a damning picture of corruption and discrimination aboard the Elysium. Andrian's arrest became headline news, sparking outrage and calls for reform across the cruise industry. Michelle watched the coverage unfold with a mix of satisfaction and frustration. The world was paying attention, but she knew how easily stories like this could fade from the public eye. She and Barack spent hours strategizing with advocacy groups and lawyers, determined to keep the pressure on. Meanwhile, Lucia's story took on a life of its own. With Michelle's encouragement, she gave a series of interviews detailing the abuse and discrimination she and other staff members had endured. Her courage resonated with viewers, inspiring others to come forward with their own stories. One evening, as Michelle scrolled through the latest headlines, a notification lit up her phone, a message from Lucia. "They're trying to scare me," it read. "I think someone's been following me." Michelle's stomach clenched. She immediately called Barack into the room. "We need to act fast," she said, showing him the message. Barack's jaw tightened. "We'll get her protection," he said, "but this just proves how far they're willing to go to cover this up." They contacted Lucia's lawyer and arranged for security. Michelle also reached out to several journalists, ensuring that any threats against Lucia would be documented and reported. "We're not going to let them intimidate her," she said firmly. As the investigation into Andrian and the cruise line deepened, more revelations emerged. Former employees came forward with testimony about years of systemic racism and exploitation. Financial records revealed bribes and cover-ups that implicated not just Andrian, but several high-ranking executives. Michelle and Barack knew they had struck a nerve when the cruise line's lawyers sent a cease and desist letter, accusing them of defamation and threatening legal action. Michelle read the letter twice before handing it to Barack. "They're desperate," she said. Barack nodded. "And scared." Their legal team wasted no time crafting a response, laying out the evidence and daring the company to take them to court. The cruise line backed down within days, but Michelle knew the fight was far from over. The breakthrough came when a whistleblower, one of Andrian's former assistants, provided a recording of a meeting in which executives discussed how to keep undesirable guests off the Elysium. The language was damning, and the recording quickly went viral. Michelle and Barack watched the fallout unfold, feeling a mix of relief and vindication. Executives resigned. Shareholders demanded accountability, and calls for industry-wide reforms gained momentum. But even as the dust began to settle, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that their work wasn't done. "We need to make sure this leads to real change," she said one evening as she and Barack sat on their porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Barack nodded. "We will." A month later, Michelle stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., addressing a packed auditorium. Lucia sat in the front row, flanked by other former staff members from the Elysium. The event had been organized by a coalition of advocacy groups, and the energy in the room was electric. "This isn't just about one ship," Michelle said, her voice steady. "It's about dismantling systems of discrimination and exploitation that have been allowed to thrive in plain sight. It's about making sure no one else has to experience what we did." The crowd erupted in applause, but Michelle's focus remained on Lucia. She saw the pride in the young woman's eyes and knew that this was only the beginning. Later that night, as she and Barack sat together, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here, Michelle allowed herself to feel a rare sense of peace. "We did it," she said softly. Barack smiled, pulling her close. "We did, but we're not done yet." Michelle nodded, her resolve firm. "No, not yet." And as the night deepened, she found comfort in the knowledge that they would keep fighting, for justice, for equality, and for a better world. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel not to miss new stories. Share this video with your friends and leave comments. We want to know what you think. Check out the other videos on the channel for more inspiring and exciting stories.